All right. Here we are with Karen Swallow Prior. And I think many of you know Karen's work. If you don't, you're in for a treat to go check out some of her work. She's currently a research professor. It's a very long title, research professor of English and Christianity
and culture
at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And she is an author. She's written many articles. And her most recent book is on reading well. And I encourage you to check it out. Karen, this morning, Byron Borger, when I talked with him, he had the cover of your book framed behind him.
Aww.
And I said, he kept saying, buy Mary's book. And I said, and there's a subliminal message to buy Karen's book too. So you're like, buy both of these books. But anyway, Karen, thank you so much for being here. It's a real treat always to get to talk to you. And I'm sure everyone's, will be excited to get to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Well, I just wanted to say, thank you for the honor of having me on your launch day. And I want to say congratulations for the beautiful book. The words are beautiful inside. The cover is beautiful. And I know this has been a long process for you. I think we talked about this book before it was even, when you were it was an idea in your mind.
Yeah.
And so, I know you and I have bonded over so much, over literature, over Fleabag shoes, but also just teaching. We both love to teach. And so I wanted to just ask you how your teaching helped kind of give birth to this book. Like, how does your teaching play into what you have to say about art and empathy?
Yes, thank you. I mean, my teaching has played a huge part, and I've said this a couple of times today, briefly, but then I can elaborate on some like examples. But I've said that I felt like a lot of the book came from my teaching, and it's kind of broadening the classroom, sort of getting this conversation out there. But I've just seen particular text and the conversations in class about those texts and how students not only do they become empathetic with the characters in the books, I've seen them transfer that to classmates and friends. So for instance, every fall I teach Othello, and so I chose something that would, again, kind of fit kind of Renaissance-y. Yeah. Maybe going back a little closer to, it's before, but a little closer to your, but yeah, Othello, I teach every fall. And Othello, although it's of course written by the ultimate white canonical author, it is about racial profiling to some degree. And, you have a Black North African character. And we've been able to talk a lot about the use of racist language in it, the type of profiling, even the kind of internalization of white supremacy within Othello, which is a kind of protective, kind of a defense, and then relating that to many current events and police shootings of African Americans, et cetera. And I have been just amazed and astounded to see how many students, even in reading Othello, many of whom they're so afraid to read any Shakespeare, and they don't think they'll like it because this is like a core class, that I teach in it, and they get into it, and not only are they able to understand it and actually enjoy the story, they're moved by it, and they're they begin to self-reflect. And I've had many students even write me notes about some of the biases that they had and they hadn't even realized, but it came out when reading Othello. And so I noted that in classes, some students that will identify with text, as if when we're reading Othello, or I also teach every spring Douglas's narrative, students that feel empowered by this conversation being had, sometimes conversations that are a bit taboo, going on in the classroom, and then they speak up and they're empowered by this, particularly like Black students Then other things like that, when we're reading Coleridge and talking about depression, or reading Gerard Manley Hopkins and talking about depression, and I'll have students, speak up about those topics. So the point is that on one hand, you see students become empathetic with the authors and the characters, but then they start to think about that, think a kind of transfer that's to the students in the class, especially when those students will even speak up because they feel a sense of, there's space now for my voice. So I guess I've just seen that happen so much, and I wanted to, write it down and to share it. And I mean, I've always believed that art had this power to kind of aid our spiritual formation, but to see how it works exactly in this way was really powerful for me. Yeah, and I have many stories of that, and but anyway, thanks for asking that. What about you in your classroom? Have you seen particular works of particular, novels or works of literature that you think have really kind of softened the hearts of your students to thinking of their classmates differently, or people they encounter differently?
Well, there's so many. I mean, all literature, good literature does this and does it well. And I guess I think that one example that's just fresh on my mind, because I've been talking about a lot, having just released my own new edition of it, is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the Thomas Hardy novel, in which he, as an author and as a narrator, exhibits so much empathy for this woman who is considered by her late 19th century society as impure and fallen, because she was sexually assaulted. And that made her impure, but he sees her, even subtitles the work, "A Pure Woman Faithfully Presented." And so he exhibits this empathy for her, and then through the complexity of the story and the other characters who are also flawed and fallen, he just elicits sympathy and empathy for all of them, even the ones that are tragically wrong and contribute to the tragic outcome. He presents the characters in such a complicated way that you can't help but have some understanding of why they are the way they are and why they've done what they've done, and if only they could have done it differently, which makes us all ask, what could we have done differently in our lives, and how can our society be different? So I think that's a tremendous novel that demands that we just understand better.
It is. I mean, that's a very powerful, and again, I think, that's some of what I've just mentioned are works of art, poems and novels in particular that deal with the topics that are the really hard parts of our humanity. Like, dealing with this is a novel about sexual assault, dealing with questions of racial injustice, or with mental illness. And it's interesting that the books that we both have brought up right now are really looking at those who tend to be, pushed aside and misunderstood. And these are giving opportunities to understand. I mean, is the best literature, does it tend to be about characters that have been misunderstood? Or is it, or in a way, have all human beings been misunderstood? I mean, I don't know. What do you think? That's kind of a weird question I just came up with.
No, I think that's a great insight. I mean, I think that I think the answer is yes. And I think in a lot of ways, the other thing that great literature does is it's the story of a character coming to understand himself or herself more,
Yes.
right? And so, yes, we can be misunderstood. We all always are. And yet at the same time, another problem that we have is not even understanding or knowing ourselves. And I think in a way, a lot of every good story is about kind of that self-revelation. The most famous being Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, when she says, "I never knew myself," at that pivotal moment when she realizes, the error she has made in judgment of Mr. Darcy. So I love that insight that you have.
Yeah, thanks. And well, it's to me that it seems reflexive too, that when literature helps us to see ourselves more clearly, and then it also helps us, it's kind of like when we begin to be honest with ourselves and also have compassion for ourselves, then maybe it's easier to do that for someone else. So it's a kind of,
Right.
maybe a reflexive relationship um between the two. So, well, I wanted to ask you on Reading Well about, this is a book about virtue
Mm.
in literature. Um, would you consider empathy adjacent to one of those virtues, or how does that fit in?
Yeah, I have a, empathy is such an interesting concept because even its definition is somewhat contested because it's in different circles and if you look up the definition in the dictionary between empathy and sympathy, they're usually the opposite of how people use them. So I
Yeah.
actually have a small section in my book in my chapter on humility, I think if I remember which chapter it is, because there is an element of humility in having empathy or sympathy for other people. And again, the words are, what I argue in my book is that sympathy is more than empathy. Like empathy is the first step, and then sympathy
Hmm.
is sort of is the next step. So I think they're both great. And usually when we talk about what Christ felt in the New Testament when he encountered those who are suffering, it's often translated as compassion.
Mhm.
That is what sympathy means. It's like not just feeling, but actually suffering with someone. So I see empathy is again, depending on the definitions get reversed a lot, but kind of is the first step is just being able to have a sense of how what someone is going through, and sympathy is really sitting and walking with them through that suffering and in a helpful way.
That is interesting because that is tend to be the flip. I mean, I quoted in Brene Brown because she talks about how sympathy is, there's a power differential. It's kind of like you're looking down
Mhm,
on,
mhm.
whereas empathy is the more entering in. But that is interesting. Makes me want
I
to
mean, I think that
sure.
distinction is actually is true, and this sometimes and so we look down on one or the other, and
Yeah.
I mean, we give sympathy cards when with the loss of someone. So I think that
Yeah.
word has been kind of degraded unnecessarily because we don't like to be pitied, and we associate it with pity. But there are long-standing sort of classical definitions of those words that I think have been lost. So yeah,
Yeah. It's it makes me think of a word like apocalypse, which the
mm,
meaning has been twisted. Um,
right,
it's
right,
just that's interesting. Well, or even the idea of the an apology,
mm,
is the
right,
opposite of what its original. So
right,
that's
yeah.
really very interesting. So,
Hmm.
but yeah,
I
that's
wanted to ask you because I mentioned that we have, that you and I share a lot in common, our love for literature and teaching and flu dogs, but also I learned recently that one of your favorite books is one of my favorite books, and that is Jane Eyre.
yes,
So can we talk about Jane Eyre and
yes,
specifically,
please.
like, especially in terms of empathy, like how does Jane Eyre help cultivate empathy in the reader?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Karen, I'm a very super contemporary lit. So one of my colleagues the other day made a joke about that something is old to me when it's from 2004, So it's funny that somebody will ask, what's your favorite novel? And I'm like, I can't deny Jane Eyre. I love Jane Eyre so much and I love teaching it. But I think, well, Jane Eyre to me is just perhaps the best novel ever written that explains what Christian love actually looks like and critiques. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so profound and it has that. Well, I taught it in a class on the prophetic imagination where we were reading Brueggemann alongside other texts, and I felt like it had the prophetic critique of like a false Christianity that was about gaining power and using biblical words to oppress, um, and then how that's the contrast to the actual the hope piece, which is when we see Jane Eyre giving, I kind of don't want to give too much of the plot away if people haven't read it, but Jane Eyre gives away, she realizes that she's been holding on to something, or to a relationship that she needs to purge herself, because she'd made this relationship with this person her idol. And only when she gives it away does she actually get it back. And so it's just such a beautiful novel, such a deeply Christian novel. But I think just Jane herself, I mean, her story, just to follow, I mean, it's fascinating to me that, and you would know much more about this than me, that to have a novel where a child is treated like a human, I mean, that's I mean, even in the time when Jane Eyre was written, that wouldn't have been that common, I guess. Well, with Dickens, I mean, but we see, we think of, children being many in orphanages and being worked as chimney sweepers and out in the street and all this. And to have, the story of this orphan, but to give her such brilliance and such dignity and such a strong spirit. And she's like the moral core of the story. I don't know. And she's a woman. So it's like you have a child who then develops into a woman, and we get a fully human picture of this child and this young woman, and we follow her story. And I mean, from contemporary eyes, I guess this isn't something incredibly unusual, but to put it in its historical context, it's quite amazing. Right. And I don't know if anybody's done it much better or better at all. So, you deeply empathize, but also empathize with the main Byronic hero figure, the main, sketchy love interest, who is is a jerk, but then he is humanized through suffering. Right. So I don't know, what do you think of when you think of empathy in that novel?
Well, I mean, all the things that you said are so true of it. And I love what Virginia Woolf said about Jane Eyre, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but she locates the power of the story in the authenticity of the voice. It's the narrative voice. This is a novel, one of the earliest novels that is told in a way that feels like it's just a person who's sitting next to us telling the story in a conversation. It's not as constructed or artificial. I mean, even as much as I love Jane Austen, her satirical art is very sophisticated and clever and witty. Charlotte Bronte's voice just feels like someone that's sitting and telling you that story, and from her heart and from her soul. And so I think that's a big part of what cultivates the empathy for the characters. The voice sounds so realistic.
Yes.
That's what Virginia Woolf said. I'm just repeating it.
Absolutely. Well, how do you feel about this is short. Wait, this is it's been a long day, so I'm not finding my words as easily as I did earlier. So the sister, Emily.
Yeah, Wuthering Heights. Yeah, I'm Team Charlotte. Definitely Team Charlotte. Yeah. Emily is too romantic for me.
Yes. It's so sentimental. That's the thing. It doesn't have this, and I've talked about this in multiple conversations today, how sentimentality doesn't can actually be a buffer to real empathy,
right?
Because it's airbrushing reality, and it's kind of pushing emotional buttons,
right?
And just am not such a big fan of Wuthering Heights, but I haven't read is it Anne?
Anne Bronte, yes, her novels are, but Castle, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, that's actually an excellent book. So.
Oh, really? Okay, I might have to give it a try one day. But
it's considered the first novelistic treatment of alcoholism.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, would you, so I asked Joe Kikasola this today about, because he's a film scholar, and I'm asking you about literature as an art form related to other art forms. Is there, if you watch a really good film or hear a really moving piece of music, is there a different way that the written word helps you to empathize than
Hmm.
seeing a film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think they are very different. I mean, film is in some ways more complicated because you've got the words of the script and you've got the acting, whether that's good or bad, and the camera work and the soundtrack. So there are a lot of things, but it's also in one sense sort of unmediated because it's because it's image and sound. But when you're reading letters on the page, then those are symbols, right? So there's something inherently more mediated and symbolic that you have to translate, even if it's, even whether it's the letters or the words. And so I think there's a kind of critical distance
Mhm.
in reading that requires more of us, and then also can give us something more because we're exercising kind of that extra layer of interpretation that letters themselves require.
Yeah, and so, well, there's something about, this has been a theme all day, is talking about how art and helping us being attentive, slowing down and being attentive. And so maybe the written word does that. And I don't want to say a more profound, because there are films that force you to do that as too, but
Mhm.
it's usually through the use of abstraction or
Right.
mystery. Whereas so many popular films are just predictable and formulaic, and whereas it's almost like the more you have to work for it, the more this can really impact who you are as a person, from reading it. But I'm also thinking with a book, with the written word, do we get more inside of the mind of the character than you can
Mm.
really do on the screen? I don't know.
Right.
Maybe, but there's now there's long form, TV series where I feel like you really get to know the character. So these things are constantly changing, and yeah, you're kind of coming to an empathetic understanding in very different ways, but all good ways. So I got one more question I've asked everyone today, and I want to ask you, just to wrap things up. And if you had to recommend one book, I think I know what you're going to say, but if you had to recommend one book that has helped you be more empathetic, and you think would maybe help others really grow their capacity for empathy, what book would you suggest?
Oh, well, it would have been Jane Eyre, but I think I'll pick another one since we talked about that, and that is Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary.
Okay.
Yes, the short story is that Flaubert opposes the romanticism of this character that he paints, but he also is so sympathetic to it. He even famously said, "I am Emma," because he fell in love with the character and understood her, even though he was writing a story that kind of exposed the flaws and the tragic outcomes of a romantic worldview. So I think that novel is just marvelous.
Wow. And that is one, here's a gap in my education. I have never read it.
You
So
would love it.
I
You would
I
love
need
it.
to, okay. Karen, I really thought you were going to say Frankenstein.
Oh, that's not my favorite novel. I hardly, I just, no. I appreciate it, but
Maybe it's because I heard you tell Phil Vischer that he needed to read it, and then
oh
you
yeah,
and I had a
everyone needs to read
conversation
it.
about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But although that is a good one for empathy, I think.
Yes. No, it
Right. Yeah.
absolutely is. It's a good choice.
Good one, but Madame Bovary. Okay, that's a great choice. So, well, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
time. I know that you've had a long Zoom day too. So,
Well, congratulations on this special day, Mary.
oh, thank
Well
you, and
done.
I appreciate you being a part of it. Means a
Thank you.
lot. So, thanks a lot. Have a good night.